Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. For our fourth episode, we have Elizabeth Sweet, Community Engagement Manager and Director of National AAPI Empower Network for National API Mental Health Association, or NAPIMA, an organization dedicated to promoting the well-being and mental health of AAPIs. Elizabeth, could you talk a little bit more about your connection and background in the AAPI community?
Yeah, absolutely. So for myself, my background is that I'm a transracial and intercountry Korean American adoptee, meaning that I was born in Korea. I was adopted as an infant into a white family, into Washington State specifically. And so I actually grew up without a lot of connection to the API community, and something I only recently was able to get more involved in when I went to college and then got involved with organizations like NAPIMA. But yeah, I definitely carry that adopted person identity and Korean American identity in my life.
Yeah, for sure. And then how does your identity as an API individual and especially a transracial adoptee kind of inform your work and the values kind of carry daily?
Yeah, absolutely. I think they deeply inform those values, right? I think for myself, a lot of my own like personal lived experience when it comes to mental health stems from being an adoptee and feeling maybe that cultural disconnect or identity fragmentation, feeling between groups. Also having, a little bit of like isolation from other, folks of color, Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, and the sense that I really feel like, in a way, because I have kind of seen and was raised by, white folks to see, all the ways in which they characterize like racial color blindness as like an attitude and things like that in the home. It gives me a really strong sense of like justice for why like racial equity is so important, why mental health visibility is so important, particularly for Asian Americans, where that's often erased, all of that. So I think deeply informs those values.
Yeah, for sure. And can you explain a little bit of how you got involved in NEPIMA and how you got to learn about this amazing organization?
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually, through the Conference on Asian Pacific American Leadership, or CAPAL, they do a summer internship program for AAPI students in undergraduate college level. And I was actually an intern in the summer of 2022, and I was placed at NAPIMA as an internship site. So I went from being a summer intern to then finishing out my undergraduate degree at the University of Washington. And then I reconnected with some folks at NAPIMA and was able to kind of be brought on then to the team as a contractor and then part-time and now full-time on staff. So I've really kind of continued to come back for more and really be engaged in the PIMA and kind of scale up my engagement. It's been really great. So I've always really felt strongly about the mission and the values here. And just again, like AAPI mental health, it was amazing to find an organization that focused on that.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great response. And can you kind of explain why you chose mental health as a specific area to kind of focus on in your work and your advocacy work for APIs?
Absolutely. So, my background is actually, I have a degree in neuroscience and political science. And so mental health feels like very much at the intersection of those two things. I'll be honest, I did go to college thinking I was maybe going to do medicine or something, or even like biomedical research, but I ended up finding like the social factors in which that inform systems of, race and justice and equity and thinking about, from a public health, whole health approach and how culture plays a role really drew me to this field more of mental health. Also, someone who has lived mental health experience. So I'll share, someone with anxiety, depression, who's had periods of SI in my life and really carries in a way like the sense of like being a survivor of adoption trauma. Like I think it's also a personally powerful thing that resonates with me, why I felt so drawn to mental health as a field and to PIMA as a whole. But yeah, so between the background, the kind of academic interest, but then more so just the sense of how do I really connect with the community and recognize what NAPIMA is doing is like really trying to fight against mental health stigma, which is something that I faced a lot of. And so just being able to open up that conversation, hopefully for others, felt really important.
Yeah, that's really, really great. I'm gonna move on to some the resistance and advocacy questions. I know DEI is still a touchy subject. Is that still okay to ask and kind of have a conversation around that? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for asking.
And then in your field of community, what kinds of rollbacks or resistance have you seen to kind of DEI efforts in the recent kind of months, and especially the conversation of mental health? Have you seen people kind of disregard that conversation?
Yes. So I will say that absolutely we in NEPIMA are noting that there is some wide systems level shifts, particularly at the federal level, as we know, around anti-DEI. And suddenly it's apparently a really bad thing to talk about community-based, population-specific disparities, differences, unique challenges, all of that. And it's interesting because for NEPIMA, we are inherently a health equity organization, right? Like we say in our name, we are focused on the API community and we focus on the health equity piece of mental health. And so it's been interesting because, we have been impacted like in terms of our federal funding. We lost some relationships with some folks who were, in the federal bureaucracy, within like, for example, the SAMHSA Office of Substance Abuse Mental Health Service Administration. They were, those folks were laid off, right? And so, a lot of those connections we had, and those were major conveners in the space where we all were able to have really impactful discussions in like the past administration about what does it mean to support ANHPI communities and mental health and advance that for our communities is going away. That infrastructure is disappearing quite rapidly, again, along with funding. But I think for us too, it's a sense of kind of like we can only at this moment own who we are, right? And we are not personally shying away from that or kind of even genericizing our message to like the mental health of everyone matters because yes, that is true, but that's kind of like an all lives matter like
Yeah.
excuse to be like rather than saying like no, more than ever, communities of color, AAPIs, immigrant communities, LGBTQIA plus folks are at risk, and we need to talk about that and really advocate for that. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. That's a great response. And can you share how like Napima is kind of like keeping on, kind of like keeping this like resistance and keeping like community advocacy during these times with even with like these crazy federal funding cuts and kind of like, losing a lot of your resources.
Yes, I would say for us, it's just really like maintaining the values we've always had. Like we've been an organization for 25 years. We were started by Dr. DJ Ida back in 2000. So this is actually our 25th anniversary year. And, at the core, we've always been, and that was actually during, that would have been during what, like, or a Republican administration, right? Or what, and, when these things, these kind of initial historic investments were made. So we see it as only just a continuation of our work deeply rooted in like, community need, right? And so we know that during the pandemic, for example, there was, a lot of anti-HPI hate and, where that, again, presented really strong mental health challenges for our communities. And so we are responding by simply kind of staying the course we always have been, which is asserting that we deserve visibility for our mental health issues. There are still existing disparities. We need to be clear about all the connections, intersections, and intersectionality of how folks are at risk across different identities. That Asian Americans, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders are not a monolith and will have unique experiences. And so for us, I think for in a way, this has only reaffirmed our commitment to like dig deeper and recognize that maybe the more, I guess, traditional Western systems, maybe not are going to support us, but that doesn't mean we can't carve out our own spaces and be very intentional about that. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. That's a great response. And then I think you mentioned like mental health during kind of like the pandemic. I think that was probably like a big flashpoint for a lot of like APIs who maybe didn't consider like mental health beforehand and kind of like, during the pandemic, coupled with the factor of like, the rise in hate crimes just being locked down. Can you kind of like speak to, and maybe you weren't there at NPM at the time, but can you kind of speak to how like, maybe personally you felt like your mental health was at risk,
Mm-hmm.
kind of like the ways in which like organizations we're fighting against like that like rise in hate crimes and trying to keep like better API mental health.
Yeah. So I would say personally, I think this is a theme that I've heard a lot from a lot of folks, and myself included. I felt it very personally, like just that sense of isolation during the pandemic, right? Everything was remote, virtual, online. For NPMO, we've always been a remote organization, but I remember like I was in college and I was taking courses. Like we moved, let's see, I was a freshman, so I would have been, I took 2 quarters in person and then we were in total lockdown. And so that was a huge transition, a huge shift. There was suddenly a lot, there was also a lot of, uncertainty for folks, right? Like information around, I think things like, the timeline of like, when to get the vaccines and the boosters, but then also like, how do you mask up, stay home, social distance? What are the boundaries around that? I think, in terms of, I can only imagine, and we've heard from like our AAPI communities, a lot of that information wasn't translated. It wasn't being given by trusted messengers in the community. And so there's a little bit of, confusion, isolation, all that as well, on top of the very directed racialized violence toward us, as ANHPI is facing, anti like yeah Asian and like COVID sentiment. And so I think it really created this, yeah, that like you said, the flashpoint for a lot of folks to kind of reckon with and realize that there was in fact a deeply seated issue, that this is like was continual, right, in the treatment of NHPIs, the criminalization or the targeting thereof. But I think also it created for folks a sense of just how important community is, how important community organizing is, how important being in solidarity with fellow BIPOC groups, because it also happened around the same time of the murder of George Floyd, right, and some other major events. And so I think, all in all, what I kind of see as the pandemic is this point in which there was a deep reckoning, and hopefully it was, in some ways, I would say yes, it was a start of some kind of first time investments into our community, whether that was research being done or just even advocacy attention being paid toward us. Which was unfortunate that it took, something of that
Yeah.
really negative nature to bring that about. But I will say that it was something that I would consider to be very instrumental in this timeline now of how we think about, continuing to sustain progress and build power and create, ANHI mental health justice. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. That's great. And then like what would you say like NAPIMA's support to API youth like who are seeking hope today? What does that look like and how can like NAPIMA kind of like serve as like a powerful shield against like the hate or like the APIs who are seeking like belonging today?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we recognize, like, I'm still, I guess, technically, like, in the young youth, young adult, like, age group, but particularly understanding that, like, in this time, for our youth, we know that, like, ANHI youth, ages 10 to 24, suicide is the leading cause of death for that group, which is, and that's a very startling, piece of information, but also something that I think is not at the same time surprising given all the challenges that young people face right now and all the pressures and also just like the external dumpster fire that is the world in some ways, particularly if you're in the U.S. But all that to say, I think for us at NAPIMA, we're really trying to dig into providing those supports, those resources, and those programs. We've been making a number of handouts, particularly to think about supporting students and youth in this time. We have a number of trainings, so at napima.org/training. We've always kind of offered our Achieving Whole Health training, body, mind, spirit, and then mental health first aid, but we're adding a new training this summer. We'd love to have folks join us if you're a high school age youth. It's called Right to Be Youth, and it's a bystander intervention training that we're adapting to be very culturally specific to ANHPI students. And I think also just really the sense of like, letting being like in a way like youth-led organizations like AAPI Youth Rising, right? It's just incredible, to have that like attention that seat at the table, not be trivialized or not like, seen as like, oh, they're just the youth-led organization. Like that's actually, where we're getting a lot of our community power and organizing and acknowledging the validity of that. I think I've been a young person before in spaces with a lot of quote unquote professionals, adults, right? That are very quick to maybe dismiss like our contributions or what we have to say. But I will say like youth advocacy, another thing during the pandemic, seeing folks stand up for Palestinian liberation, for example, was huge, right? And to know that there's so much power in our youth, I think the PIMA is really aiming to embrace that through again programs, trainings, the resources we're developing, and also just engaging, yeah, with youth. And and I know we had some of folks who were like our Vote for Wellness civic engagement ambassadors, for example. We always invite youth to join our NAPIA network of ANHPIs with lived mental health experience. That's on our website, napima.org/Napian, NAAPIEN. It's on my screen here too. But yeah, so I think, in this way, we're really trying to build that out along with, like we've had a longstanding youth program called Friends Do Make a Difference. It's been traditionally run out of Denver, Colorado, but we're really hoping to try to find a way to bring that nationally. And really empower, more and more youth who are ANHPI to, have conversations about mental health and identity and the power within them and the resilience within them around those things, and equipping them with the tools to be able to talk to family, have intergenerational conversations and all that. So yeah.
Yeah, that's really, really great. And then can you, I think you mentioned Napian. Can you kind of like talk about like a little bit about your work in that and kind of explain what the network's kind of like goals are as a whole?
Absolutely. So NAPIAN, again, is the National AAPI Empowerment Network, or NAPIAN. And what this means is that, it's a kind of a really unique space because I don't think there's another like it right now that is solely, kind of for folks who are self-identified ANHPIs with lived mental health experience. And what lived mental health experience, it can take a lot of different forms. We're not trying to restrict it to any one thing, but some examples of what they can look like is folks who themselves face mental health challenges, diagnoses, mental illness, are perhaps the caretaker or caregiver, excuse me, or parent or provider for someone with those challenges, and so they are in that unique position because there's a unique mental health, situation for folks in those positions, as well as folks who are survivors, whether of like loss, suicide loss, of friends and family members, or themselves, or maybe attempt survivors. Also, folks who identify in the spectrum of neurodivergence, disability, etc., who really have no other kind of space where they can kind of come as they are, if you will, with their full range of, mental health, neurodiversity concerns, and just like realities and just be. And so for us at Nopian, it's really about building space, hosting monthly listening sessions, community building sessions, sometimes like art workshops, things like that, to really let folks have that space to process. We're not like a therapy group, like we're not ourselves like behavioral health providers, but we just think the power of like peer support of being able to come as you are, as I said, to really destigmatize these topics, like where folks can just casually talk about what it means to, navigate, sometimes having like a terrible experience with a therapist, right? Who's very like maybe Western centric or white or just didn't get our experiences at ANHPIs, of folks talking about things like medication or diagnoses with things like ADHD, right? Like it's like places where to really like peel back the curtain on that and create an open space where folks can feel kind of like there's this baseline of understanding, and they don't have to explain themselves because I feel like that's often a burden of like invisible emotional labor that we as ANHPIs have to go through to like to talk about like all these things, like these underlying cultural considerations and the ways in which like our families and intergenerational traumas might show up. But I feel like in Napian, we're able to kind of all level with one another and we all kind of just get it, which is a really refreshing thing. So that's a space we try to build with that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think you mentioned like, cultural considerations and intergenerational trauma. Can you kind of like explain like how those specifically manifest in like the API community and kind of like the specialized concerns like relating to like APIs or young APIs who like have like maybe like, maybe families who like are not really like open to talking about mental health. And can you like explain a little bit about that?
Mhm. Yeah, I'm happy to. And I think, to note that it is so diverse and sometimes it's presentation across, AA and HPI groups, recognizing there's so many maybe like there's similar threads but differing legacies of various forms of colonialism, imperialism, racial trauma and the like, that impact, various groups at a specific level, right? To each like, ethnic group or even like linguistic group. But I think, for example, I can take like my experience as a Korean American adoptee and note just like the idea that the legacy of US imperialism in Korea, the Korean War, creating this like adoption industry, if you will, of like exporting babies, Korean children, and also just largely Asian children to the US into the hands of like white parents, the families of white folks. Like, I think that's deeply seated in a number of legacies, that is a form of like racial violence. But all that to say, like, I think that's something that, is biologically carried in the bodies of folks like myself. It's also something that, I think in our minds too, we feel the pressures and expectations. I think for me, that often manifested as an adopted person of like, oh, I have to prove my worth. Like, I deserve to be here because, that kind of thing. Like, I was quote unquote chosen to be, brought to the US and those things. And I think similarly, other folks with immigration stories, regardless of whether you're first gen or third gen or what have you, can perhaps relate. And so I think these manifest in these very nuanced and layered ways in which it could impact like our day-to-day behaviors as ANHPI, but could also impact, how comfortable we feel like taking up space even, right? Because of the prevalence of, hyper invisibilization of ANHPIs or thinking about how often the model minority myth, whether it's about student performance or just in general how we exist in the world, impact our ability to ask for help, right? And so I think these things are, kind of well observed across, our various communities and often a point of, again, like the not being space will bring that up and everyone's like, yeah, me too. Like raise your hand if you've ever felt this. Everyone raises their hand, but it's just very rarely talked about. And so I think for us at NEPIMA, it's noting that and noting that there's these deeply held like backgrounds and experiences that we all draw from and carry in a way and that unfortunately that can be something that is obscured by the lack of attention given to it at times. So that's really a big part of our mission then is to really kind of shine a light on that, to talk about it, to highlight it and acknowledge that it's a very real thing. And also it's just the constant low grade like stress of being a marginalized minoritized group as well. I think is something that can't be ignored and just how it impacts it's just everything, right? From our like physical, our again, our body, our mind, and our spirit all intertwined, all of those impacts.
Yeah, for sure. Now I'm gonna ask a couple questions about mental health. They could be like as personal as you want them to be or not personal at all. Is that okay?
Okay. Yeah,
Um,
sure.
yeah. How do you like take care of your mental health while doing this kind of like advocacy work?
I will say that it requires a good amount of what I call like compartmentalization. It requires a good amount of like kind of knowing that you are part of something bigger than yourself, which means that you can't always be the one to like change things instantly. In that sense, you can't always get quite as frustrated. Like, you try to tell yourself not to get frustrated or too exhausted, but also recognize that you're part of a collective effort. So I absolutely think that that's, kind of the mindset I have to have. And then just taking care of my mental health, is something where it's like taking breaks too, knowing when to step away and to acknowledge like that's sometimes a healthy thing you can do is create a little separation.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there's frequently like, a stigma in API communities about kind of like discussing mental health issues. And so how can API communities kind of better center mental health to care for each other? And what does like centering like mental health as like a conversation kind of like look like in terms of like best practices?
Yeah, so the stigma is real, I'll say that. I also don't think it's this impossible like wall that we can never like kind of slowly transform or break down or what have you in that metaphor. I think for us again, like we frame, our one of our successful trainings is, achieving whole health, body, mind, spirit. And that framing of that your whole health, holistic wellness, right, is a combination of those three things. So maybe for folks where there is a lot of stigma, you don't start with talking about like mental health and depression or whatever, because maybe there's not even a word for that in their native language. But maybe you can say, well, in the same way that you want to feel hydrated and nourished and take care of your body, we also have to do that for the mind, right? Or we have to do that for the spirit. And sometimes things can feel heavy on our minds and spirit, right? And in that way, we need to nourish ourselves. And so, kind of creating those, meeting people where they're at with those relatable frameworks that really expand on them beyond just maybe like this like really clinical psychological, I don't know how to describe it, like kind of like, again, like the Western model of like mental health is like, we're talking about therapists and we're talking about antidepressants, right? But more to like, what is it, something that resonates culturally with folks in our communities? I think that's a great way to start and to kind of start to wear down that stigma or open it up so that people realize there isn't actually any stigma. There's nothing, no shame there. Yeah.
Yeah, that's for sure. And like, I guess like, how has your understanding of mental health kind of like evolved since you started working within the API community, or since you started working with NIPIMA?
Yeah, it's definitely evolved. I think I again like to the point of, being kind of isolated growing up from like, wider ANHPI or like, culture and community and whatnot. I think I had a very deep like personal experience of just like, oh, I feel so alone. Like no one else is going through this. I'm like just a hot mess or I'm, broken or what have you. But I think having since connected with the PIMA, where I'll say like most of us on staff have lived experience, it's been a really kind of incredibly like poignant, powerful thing to realize, no, in fact, I'm not alone. And that there's actually a deep level of like, courage involved with like owning your lived experience and talking about it and being open about mental health. And there are actually a number of people who are doing it too and can do it along with you. So I think that's been a huge like part of my evolution around my understanding. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess like, mm, kind of like in your experience, what kind of like mental health resources or approaches kind of like tend to resonate with like most with like API youth, and like yeah, like what do you think like kind of like the best practices to approaching it are?
Yeah, I would say youth are motivated, they're plugged in, they're creative, they're aware. I think trusting them with that, right? Like again, like I think it's one of the things like youth can tell their stories. And sometimes they need a little bit of, training or guidance or whatnot, but like they have it within them to tell you, what they need, what they're about, what's the, the day-to-day pressures and things that they're facing. And so I think this like that trust, building that trust within youth. I also say like allowing youth to express themselves or things like we do a lot of what we call healing through the arts, right? And
Mhm.
recognizing like youth are so creative again like doing things like this kind of like podcast stuff, and I think for some folks like other generations they're like whoa, like the youth of today are so technologically like plugged in and they know how to use social media, and so I think there's a lot of power there, a lot of skills that need to be recognized and embraced and just given like the opportunities to do them and to have those conversations. So I would say that's like a huge like observation for us at NAPIMA, and we like to try to as best we can equip folks, yeah, with the in those be in those spaces and to feel empowered, because absolutely I think it's not a matter of we need a certain generation to like like steward the youth, like yes, steward them, but not like expect that they don't have any, they're not coming in with anything to offer. They have a lot to offer. They have really important perspectives. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. That's a great response. And then what kind of like advice would you give to like API youth listeners who are kind of like seeking hope during these times?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm actively reckoning with this as well, but I'll say just the sense that like something I've recently heard that I really like is the sense that like we as NHPIs, like we carry historical ancestral legacies of deep resilience. Like our ancestors had to, survive migration, immigration, genocide, displacement, what have you, in our respective histories to be here today, for us to be here today. And so that's something I think that we can acknowledge, like that we're part of a legacy of that. I'll also say the sense too that because of those experiences ancestrally and historically, like we carry with us like a deep sense of like justice and like almost like seated like rage, but in a good way, like the rage in which we can express to make change. And so I think we have like those really powerful, almost like invisible, unseen tools that are just part of us. And so I think to like really, if nothing else, you can like rely on yourself in that way and know that it's not just you alone, it's you with all the ancestors or all the folks in your family or lineage or what have you, right? Like even for myself as an adoptee who like doesn't have any connection to that, I can still in a way feel it and know deeply like there is something like greater that I'm a part of in that that kind of thread of things. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And then how would you say you like kind of stay grounded or helpful in the face of kind of like opposition or people kind of like attempting to discredit API mental health as like a serious issue?
Yeah, I will say that most of the folks, who are discrediting it are discrediting a lot of things that are just factually incorrect. So
Mhm.
sometimes it's
Yeah,
not
yeah.
hard or too frustrating. But I will say, sometimes it's true that you meet someone who's just very seated in the belief of maybe things like the mono minority myth of like we genuinely don't have any problems. And they themselves could be A and HPI, right? And so I think that point or to those folks, it's really coming with a deep sense of like of empathy, for that understanding of just like how systemic, that and prevalent those attitudes can be.
Mhm.
And then coming from it again, like meeting with them where they're at. And then also for me, I would say it's a lot of recognizing like I almost find it funny, right? Like not to take it too seriously in a way too,
Yeah.
because sometimes you hit a point of like, that's a little ridiculous. It's out of touch with reality. Let's still have a conversation nonetheless and like see what happens. But like, LOL, like what are
Yeah.
we gonna do, right? You can only give so much, and you can, yeah, and hope that it leaves some sort of impression or makes them wonder, or explore a little more on, your side of things. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And then like looking back at your younger self, what would you tell them kind of like now about mental health and emotional resiliency during like challenging times?
Yeah. As someone who was, when I was younger, definitely had some really dark times, I would say the sense that, we're always flowing. We're always like in this, like, I don't know if you think like a river and there's like a stream, right? Like that's a good metaphor, I guess. Like, and that, you'll never be at the same point again because you're always moving, I guess, what's the metaphor, downriver in some way, right? And so this idea that, it's easy sometimes to feel stuck, but you're never truly stuck. You're just at a different point down the overall, again, the river, if we're gonna like make it a metaphor, right? But maybe you're just on different like parts of the bank or whatever. And so I think that's something that I kind of hold or can feel like is something I would have told my younger self, because I think it was so easy to feel stuck and like there was nowhere to go. And also just recognize that, like, healing and living and activism and what have you are all non-linear ongoing processes, and they're supposed to be. There is no like true end destination where you're going to feel perfectly healed or your mental health's going to
Yeah.
be perfect or any of that. Like perfection is really never a reality, but it is something. There's like, of course, the progress of it all. So that would be, yeah, what I would share.
Yeah, for sure. And then before we wrap up, do you have any questions or topics that you would like to speak about or a message that you like our API youth listeners to hear about?
Oh, no, just if you'd like to follow like Napima on Instagram, we're at Napima, NAAPIMHA. Would love to, connect with you. And yeah, I think we in general, love, incorporating youth voices and youth feedback. And I think for us, in this time, we just want to remind folks that you genuinely are not alone, that we see how, like, we recognize these are challenging times, absolutely. But I also think, I think we're going to surprise ourselves in how much our community can still accomplish and how much power, yeah, we can generate. And so I'm excited to see where this goes, especially where the next generation takes it.
Yeah, for sure. And then to wrap up, we're gonna do some quick take questions that are kind of like not related to like content, but just like, fun things to wrap it up. Are you a morning person or more of a night owl?
I'm a morning person,
Mhm.
absolutely. I'm like in bed by like 9 p.m. and all my roommates make fun of me. So yeah.
Yeah. What's your go-to like comfort food right now?
Ooh, probably just anything that's like soup, like
Mhm.
noodles and stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
filming. Yeah, yeah, for sure. If you could like instantly master one skill, what would it be?
Ooh, I feel like I would love to be like a master of like Taekwondo, which is like the Korean
Hmm.
martial art. Like that would be really cool.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. What's a small joy that's been getting you through like the week?
Yeah, this is usually my answer pretty much any week, but it's my corgi. Her name is Edamame. She's a lot of energy, she's a lot of fun, and yeah, I love being a dog around who's just full of that. Yeah.
Do you have her right now?
I don't. I think she's in the other room, but yeah, she loves people. So if she was right here, I would have like picked her up and she would have
Yeah,
like given the screen probably a big lick or something.
yeah. What's like the last song you've had on repeat?
Oh, it's been Anxiety by Doechii.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. What's your favorite way to like unwind after a long day?
I call it floor time, be fully horizontal on the floor. Yeah.
That's good. What's a book, show, or movie that you've like recommended to others recently or you've recently like watched and really enjoyed?
Yeah, probably everyone on the sun, but like Sinners, please see Sinners. It's making a
Mhm.
historic run at the box office. It's a great film from Ryan Coogler and Michael B. Jordan. And yeah, I loved it.
Yeah. What's one thing you wish people asked you more about?
Ooh, I get asked a lot like, how are you doing?
Mhm.
Kind of thing. But like I feel like I wish people kind of would ask a little bit more of it. I just say fine because I'm usually never not
Yeah,
just fine.
yeah,
There's
yeah.
usually more to unpack there. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure. What's something unexpected that always like kind of makes you smile?
Ooh, I would say gosh. Oh, actually it's the fact that I live in a neighborhood that there'll just be like random like little like, know if they're domesticated or wild, like little bunnies that are like just
Mm,
like pop up, and then you like open the window or you like open the door and you'll just see one. And
that's
you're like,
wild.
okay, random, but it's cute. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. And then lastly, what's like one word that you'd want to carry with you through like the rest of the year?
Mm, I think honestly, it's rest. I think
Mhm.
absolutely. I think I would want anyone to embrace rest, particularly for folks. It's A&H Dry Heritage Month, which means that yes, we're celebrating, but also it's a lot of labor on us sometimes. So like,
Yeah.
yeah, please embrace rest. I want to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. That's great. Thank you again for sharing your time and perspective. Your story is a powerful example of how API individuals continue to rise and resist. I can't wait to share your voice with others, especially young people who are looking for guidance and inspiration. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Maxwell. Yeah,
Thank
take care.
you. Too.